Well, we're on chapter 6 now. This is another one that is difficult in some ways. And I know I was kind of depressed after I finished preparing, the lecture and that type of thing. And that's violence in sports. And, some of you may be much more familiar with this than I am. It's different standing back and studying things than it is being immersed in them. So, this quote, I think, is, I think it was the quote that I chose that is so disturbing. And this is it. It's the most perfect feeling in the world to know that you've hit a guy just right, that you've maximized the physical pain he can feel. You feel the life just go out of him. You've taken all this man's energy and just dominated him. And that is a quote from Michael Strahan, NFL player in 2000. So here are some examples of violence in sports. Concussions, repeated head traumas in football and other sports are connected with serious long-term health problems such as dementia. And we've had so much media about that recently that I'm sure you're quite familiar with that. That's one example. Two high-profile team members of a high school football team were found guilty of raping an unconscious young woman. That's another type of violence that is related to sports. A terrorist attack during the 2013 Boston Marathon killed 3 people and injured 264. And one of the most rapidly growing spectator sports in the U.S. is mixed martial arts, with often brutal fights staged in fenced cages. These examples and more indicate that violence in sports is an important topic to study in order to develop and understand these 6 points. The first one is to have a practical definition of violence. The second is to look at a brief, historical overview of violence in sports. The third is the incidents and consequences of on-the-field violence. 4, the relationship between on the field and off the field violence, okay? There is a relationship between on the field violence and off the field violence. Okay? 5th, violence among sports spectators. And 6th, the threat of an incident of terrorism at sport events. So first, let's get the definition of violence. What is violence and the meaning of violence, of course, like everything we're studying, particularly to do with norms, is socially constructed. So, therefore, definitions vary from person to person and from society to society. So, we're going to use the definition developed by international experts at the World Health Organization, the WHO. Okay, and here it is. I'm quoting the intentional use, excuse me, the intentional use of physical force or power, threatened or actual, against oneself, another person, or against a group or community that either resists or has a high likelihood that either results or has a high likelihood of resulting in injury, death, psychological harm, maldevelopment, or deprivation. So, according to this definition, violence can be physical, sexual, psychological, or involve deprivation and neglect. In all cases, some form of harm to self or others occurs, even when there's no explicit intent to do harm. Okay? So, you can, let me repeat this. In all cases, some form of harm or harm to self or others occurs even when there's not an explicit intent to do harm. Let's take an example of that, say violence to self. That's part of this definition, harm to self or others. Uh, Overtraining or taking performance enhancing drugs, most athletes are not attempting to harm themselves by doing it, but it's causing harm. So there's an in most cases, violence involves actions taken to dominate, control, or intimidate others. And it's connected with the dynamics of power in relationships between individuals, groups, or countries seeking control. So we often think of violence as illegal or unsanctioned, but there are situations in which violence is socially encouraged and approved. So for instance, when violence is tied to a rejection of social norms, it is usually classified as illegal and it's punished. Violence is tied to a rejection of social norms. It is usually classified as illegal and punished. However, when violence occurs in connection with enforcing social norms or protecting people and property, it is usually approved and seen as necessary to preserve social order. Okay, so the reaction to violence is situational. It might be tolerated or even glorified when used by police, soldiers, or when athletes are perceived to be pursuing victories, quote, for the team. However, when it occurs in a widespread rejection of norms, it is often described as anarchy or lawlessness. Now, once again, I'm hoping that you can take this uh, sociological analysis and in some cases apply it to something other than sports or just realize that sports is part of the society as a whole. Okay. Let's say that last one again because it's so important. However, when violence occurs in widespread rejection of norms, it is often described as anarchy or lawlessness. The peace movement is an example of that, the anti-Vietnam War movement. There wasn't a lot of violence, but there was some occasionally. But that was not perceived well by a majority of the American public because it was a rejection of norms that we were at war in Vietnam, etc. When it occurs in connection with extreme overconformity to norms, it's often viewed as morally righteous, even when people are maimed or killed or property is destroyed. In sports, for example, punching a referee for penalizing you is a rejection of social norms. It is defined as illegal by and punished by teams and sports organizations. However, it's different when a football player gives a punishing tackle breaking the ribs of an opponent. What's that? Well, that kind of violence helps to achieve a desired goal and is seen as acceptable. It's highlighted on video replays and it gives status you get status from other teammates if you're the one who did the tackle. So one of the major findings about violence that it is primarily about control. And we see this in domestic violence studies over and over and over again. It's about control. Okay? Violence works. It makes people do what they otherwise would not do. And violence, so now let's look at violence in sports throughout history. And it's certainly not new to sports. I mean, you can go back to ancient Rome and Greece and the gladiators and the blood sports and also ancient Mayan cultures and the Aztecs had some pretty violent sports and medieval tournaments. The knights and all are armored, with long lances and trying to knock somebody off a galloping horse running at each other. Can you imagine what that's like to get knocked off a horse in all that heavy metal armor at a gallop, with a lance? And a lance may pierce armor, you can't tell. And then, of course, there's all the animal, quote, sports that are so terribly violent. So early forms of competitive sports were very loosely governed, as you might imagine, by rules. And they led to the death and injuries at a much higher rate than today, something we may not quite fully grasp, okay, because it's high today, but it was much higher, okay. So social historian at the rates, okay. Social historians point out that the rates of violence in sports do not automatically decrease over time either. As actions and emotional expressions have become more regulated, players and spectators view controlled violence as exciting. So that's the difference between historical violence in let's take modern history in American sports, where there was a lot of violence, early on, 100 years ago, let's say. But now what we have is what's called control violence, which is used, it's in quotes, which is seen as exciting. So also with commercialization and professionalization and globalization, uh, you know, new forms of violence have occurred, such as goal-oriented and entertainment-oriented violence. That's increased. According to the sociologist Eric Deming, violence is a crucial social issue because the goal of modern sports is to create tension rather than eliminate it. Now, isn't that interesting? See, we think of going to sports events as fun and, maybe relaxing, I don't know. But from a sociological perspective, that's not what they're about. They're about actually um, creating tension. In addition, sports reproduce an ideology that naturalizes the power of men over women. Now, violence in the field comes in multiple forms and is based in the sport ethic, which we talked about in the last chapter, commercialization, ideas about masculinity, and strategies used in sports. So, violence has significant consequences for athletes. We're going to look at the types of violence. So the following points that we're going to talk about were developed by Mike Smith, who's a Canadian sociologist, and he was concerned and did some research about violence in ice hockey and what the consequences of that were. So he developed this model of thinking about violence in sports. The first is called brutal body contact. And this is usually accepted by athletes as part of sports participation. So examples are collisions, hits, tackles, blocks, body checks. Although they're expected, they often provoke retaliation naturally. The second kind of violence is what's called borderline violence. And those are actions that violate the rules of the game, but are accepted by most coaches and players as consistent with the norms of the sports ethic. So those examples are brushback, pitch in baseball, a forcefully placed elbow or knee in basketball. And the severity of punishment has increased in some sports for this borderline violence. The third type is what is his name? The researcher? Mike Smith, okay, is what Smith defined as quasi-criminal violence. And that consists of actions that violate the formal rules of the game, public laws, and even informal norms among players. So things like cheap shots, late hits, sucker punches, flagrant fouls, and usually fines and suspensions result from that type of violence. The fourth type that he identifies, Smith, is criminal violence. It's relatively rare, and that's actions that are taken that are clearly outside of the law. And examples of that are assaults during games that are premeditated and severe enough to kill or seriously maim a player. Interestingly, when it occurs, It's seldom prosecuted as a crime because sports are viewed, and this is such a key point, as a special social context in which risks of physical harm are voluntarily accepted by athletes. So, criminal violence, think of the name, that's the most intense kind, seldom prosecuted. Okay, that's enough. And let's go back to the examples again. Assaults during games that are premeditated and severe enough to kill or seriously maim a player. Okay. To kill or seriously, yes, okay. And they're rarely prosecuted. So the lines identifying these four types of violence over time change as norms change. And they also, as Coakley is pointing out about Smith's research on these four types of violence, they also fail to address, and this is so important, the origins of violence and the relationship of violent acts to the sports ethic, to gender ideology, and the commercialization of sports. So let's look at violence and overconformity to the norms of the sports ethic. We discussed this in the previous chapter, in chapter 5, overconformity, but we're reviewing it here again in this context. So violence over conformity to the norms of the sports ethic. Here's a point. Athletes usually know what their coaches and teammates expect when it comes to dedication to the game and not letting fear of injury inhibit their actions on the field. Even when concerned about the dangers of brutal body contact and borderline violence, they usually accept and may use them to enhance their status, identities, and popularity. Another point. Conversely, athletes who engage in quasi-legal violence are generally condemned by coaches, teammates, and spectators. Violence related to overconformity to the norms of the sports ethic is also partly related to the identity insecurities of athletes, excuse me, who often take extreme measures to prove themselves, even if it involves violence. So willingly facing violence and playing in pain honors the importance of the game, the sports ethic, and the culture. This is not limited to men, although it is much more common among them, as you might expect. Women also overconform, and when they play contact sports, they must draw a line, like men, between assertive physicality and violence. So there's a difference. Assertive physicality is one way of being, and actual violence is another. And research from the Canadian women's ice hockey team shows that contact sports and its consequences creates drama, excitement, strong emotion, and an interpersonal bond among female athletes. Well, here's an interesting point. What about how commercialization works in conjunction with violence in sports? Well, the first point is that some athletes in power and performance sports are paid well for their willingness and ability to do violence on the field. Athletes in high schools and colleges and sports clubs are paid little or nothing. However, they may still engage in violence despite the pain and injuries. Another point, football players and others in contact sports engaged in it before television coverage and the promise of big salaries, and maimed and killed each other at much higher rates, this is rates again, than the death and injury rates in football today. So let's say that again. Previously, before television coverage and the promise of huge giant salaries, football players and other athletes in contact sports maimed and injured each other at a very high rate. There are more injuries today because there are more players, but it's not true to say that it's caused mainly by commercialization. So that's a really important point, isn't it? Because that's an excuse that's used a lot for violence in sports, is that, well, it's commercialization that's caused it. It's an important point to note that that's not the main cause, because one argument is that if all athletes were true amateurs, only played for the love of the game, there would be less violence. But that conclusion contradicts research findings. Rather, what's causing the violence is not huge salaries or fan reaction or that anything else. It's not that that doesn't contribute, those things don't contribute to it. But what the basic research findings show is that it's the deep cultural and ideological roots of violence in particular sports and societies. You could take the money away, but violence would still remain if there were not cultural changes. It's a crucial, crucial point. People don't like to look at it, they don't like to acknowledge it. Okay? Most people resist the notion that cultural changes are needed to control violence. And you may be feeling that way as you read and hear this. The reason that there's resistance to it is because it places the responsibility on all of us, not just the quote bad actors, the athletes and greedy team owners. It places it on all of us and to create the change in this. So it's very difficult to critically examine our own culture and the normative and social organization of sports that people watch and enjoy. Similarly, it's difficult to critically re-examine the definitions of masculinity and gender regulations because they have for so long been accepted as the quote natural order. So what's the point? The point is that commercialization has never been the primary cause of violence in sports. Here's some examples. For many young men, mixed martial arts and ultimate fighting championships represent the same thing that boxing once did for their fathers and grandfathers, the ultimate measure of manhood, endurance, and guts. According to an MMA commentator, the UFC is popular because, quote, people enjoy violence, especially in a controlled environment. And that's a key point, the controlled environment. Similarly, violent images and or words are often used to promote sports events. And finally, heavy contact sports involves a complex and intense mixture of passion, pleasure, violence, anxiety, fear, and pain that creates unique experiences. At its foundation, it is linked to the desire to dominate and control others and disrupt an opponent's desire to do the same. It also, as we learned in the previous chapter, creates special bonds and mutual respect between athletes. And those bonds reaffirm and anchor their identities. Many athletes who play inherently violent sports say little about what they do. They don't expect others to understand because they're outside their unique social world of the team, of whatever violent sport they're playing. So therefore, to say that commercialization motivates violence against athletes is less accurate than that commercialization enables people, mostly men, to play these sports. Although the pay can be high, it's not the primary motivating factor for the violence. So let's look at gender ideology and violence in sports. This is another section that I know may use an old terminology, push people's buttons. Be as open as you can and hear it. And I hope you'll think about it and consider it. It's all based on sociological research. So, gender ideology. and violence in sports. It's not limited to men, but if we really want to understand it, we need to understand gender ideologies and issues of masculinity in our culture. Now, we're going to really explore this, take a very deep dive into it in the next chapter, in chapter 7. But we're going to start on it here, okay? So, in Mike Messner's research, he found that young men come to sport with identities that lead them to define their athletic experience differently than females do. Despite the fact that few males truly enjoy hitting and being hit, and that one has to be socialized, a key point, into participating in the violence that is common in sport. It's not natural. One has to be socialized into it, because who enjoys hitting and being hit? Okay. So one has to be socialized into participating in the violence that is common to sport. Males often view aggression within the rule-bound structure of sport as legitimate, okay, as an exception to the norm of the rest of the world of not using violence. In many societies, participation in these types of sports has become an important way to prove masculinity. One of the other major points here is that athletes can avoid social labels such as pussy, girl, fag, wimp, and sissy. And this learning socialization begins in youth sport. We talked about that in socialization into youth sports, okay? So by the time young men are involved in power and performance sports, they accept brutal body contact and borderline violence as, quote, normal, part of the game played by real men. Now, when women do violence in sport, it may also be seen as a sign of commitment or skill, but here's a key point. It is not seen as proof of femininity as it is a proof of masculinity for male athletes, and it's not seen as a proof of femininity for the following reasons. The first one is the dominant gender ideology in many cultures links manhood with the idea to do violence, but there's no similar link between womanhood and violence. Therefore, female athletes who engage in violence do not receive the same support and rewards that men receive unless they wrestle in a WWE, fight in mixed martial arts, or skate in roller derby. Those are the three exceptions. Wrestling, fighting in mixed martial arts, or roller derby for women. Then they get some kind of rewards or kudos for violence. Despite recent publicity given to a few women fighters, violent sports are viewed by many as support for the belief that hierarchical distinctions between men and women are grounded in nature and cannot be altered. Now, we're going to see in the next chapter that that's not true, but it's a very strong cultural belief. Power and performance sports emphasize sex differences in terms of physical strength, control through domination, and status as a reward for physical conquest. So let's think about this. The violence in sports emphasize sex differences in terms of physical strength, control through domination, and status as a reward for physical conquests. This idea of gender ideologies is common in many cultures, as we know, and the stakes of preserving it are so high that male boxers, for example, are paid millions of dollars for brutalizing one another in the ring, basically. Heavyweight boxers are among the highest paid athletes because they reinforce the idea that two men in a violent confrontation is, quote, nature in action, even if they're losing millions of brain cells while they do so. The irony of this approach is that if this gender ideology were actually natural and true, of course, there would be no need to reaffirm it. right? You wouldn't have to prove it if it were natural and true. You wouldn't have to reaffirm it through violent sports or any other way. Gender would simply exist. But power and performance sports are used as valuable tools because the men who play them serve as models of manhood in many countries. When women participate in violent sports, they confuse the logic, right, used to reaffirm traditional beliefs about gender. So, therefore, some people argue that women should not participate in these sports, and if they do, to treat them as jokes, oddities, or freaks of nature. And here's an interesting thing. Women in violent sports creates a dilemma for people who advocate for progressive changes in gender ideology. Because although participation of women in violent sports contradicts the belief that women are frail and vulnerable, it also at the same time reaffirms beliefs that have traditionally disadvantaged women. So therefore, some people who support gender equity in sports hesitate to encourage girls and women to participate in violent sports. So this next section is titled The Institutionalization of Violence in Sports, and it has become institutionalized. We're going to see how and why that has occurred. Certain forms of violence are built into the culture and structure of certain sports. So controlling institutional violence, as you might imagine, is extremely difficult. It's much easier to say bad player than bad system, okay, bad institution. It requires changing the culture and the structure of a particular sport. So how do men learn this? This section is called Learning to Use Violence as a Strategy in Men's Contact Sports. So athletes in heavy contact sports learn to use intimidation, aggression, and violence as strategies for success. They're encouraged to use intimidation, aggression, and violence as strategies for success. They disapprove of the quasi-criminal and criminal violence for the most part, but they accept brutal body contact and borderline violence as long as it occurs within the rules of the game. There's the out, right? The justification or the out. Well, it's in the rules of the game. Okay. So in boxing, football, ice hockey, rugby, and others, athletes use violence to promote their careers, increase drama, and enhance publicity. It's also used in games when coaches use players as designated agents of intimidation and violence. And these guys are called enforcers, goons, and hitmen, like the mafia, right, or organized crime. And they're expected to protect teammates and assist their teams by intimidating, provoking, fighting with, or injuring opponents. Now, those acts done by the enforcers are an accepted part of certain sports, especially ice hockey. Some athletes are beginning to challenge this, primarily because it's one of the major causes of head trauma. So how does this next part happen? Learning to use violence as a strategy in women's contact sports. Well, naturally, there's not much information about this because nobody's done that much research into it. But it's known that more women are participating in violent contact sports than they used to, and that women's sports increasingly are emphasizing power and performance. So as women participate more in the social world of elite power and performance sports, women athletes become more tolerant of violations and aggressive actions. And as they compete at higher levels, they often become similar to men in embracing the sport ethic and forming their identities as athletes by taking risks, making sacrifices, playing despite pain, an injury, and dedicating themselves to the game. However, it is rare for them to link toughness, physicality, and aggression to what it means to be a woman. And similarly, coaches don't try to motivate female athletes by telling them to go out and prove who the better woman is, as they do with male athletes, to prove who the better man is, not the better woman. So, what are the consequences of violence on the field? Well, spectators view violence on the field in a paradoxical manner because they accept brutal body contact and borderline violence, but the injuries they cause make them kind of uneasy. So, what spectators actually want is violence without consequences, right? Like the fictionalized violence in the media and the video games, which engage in brutality without anybody being seriously injured. So the research on pain and injury among athletes shows that violence in sports has very real consequences, which I'm sure many of you are quite aware of. The rates of disabling injuries are high enough in many sports to be an actual public health issue. And the quote normal brutal body contact and borderline violence causes arthritis, concussions, brain trauma, bone fractures, torn ligaments, and other injuries. And they may cause permanent damage that requires future medical attention. Concussions, head hits, and brain injuries. We said we'd get to this, and here we are. They are found primarily in football, but also ice hockey, soccer, lacrosse, boxing, and mixed martial arts. And so most of the research shows a relationship between trauma and CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. Between 2013 and 2020, there were over 100 lawsuits about brain injury in those sports. Most important for the future of what's happening and the media around this and our knowledge of it now is that parents are increasingly concerned about the safety of their children and really looking into these programs. Also, school districts, college football and athletic departments and sports organizations that sponsor football are facing a major crisis, as nearly all insurance companies are now refusing to cover damages related to head injuries in collision sports. So the growing awareness of research findings that identify the consequences of violence in sports led the U.S. Congress and half of all state legislatures and many sports organizations to create regulations and protocols to protect young people who play sports, and especially those sports in which there's a possibility for head trauma. Now we're going to look at controlling violence in the field. And the roots of violence in the playing field, as we learned last chapter, are rooted in overconformity to the sport ethic, commercialization, definitions of masculinity, and competition strategies. So brutal body contact is the most difficult form of violence in the field to control because it's grounded in the culture of power and performance sports and dominant gender ideology in sports. 90% of serious injuries in these sports occur, this is really interesting, within the rules of the game. I'm going to say that again. 90% of serious injuries in these high-performance sports occur within the rules of the game and contests, which means that men pay the price for their destructive definitions of sport and masculinity, because they're the ones who get hurt, right? The players. Control of brutal body contact requires changes in gender ideology and the cultures of certain sports. And those changes won't occur if the language that people use to reproduce violent sports cultures and gender ideologies do not also change. Our language is very, very powerful. and it often underlays the foundation of the way we think about things, the way we hold things and beliefs and ideas. Gender ideology is a perfect example. I know in one class I took years ago, uh, when I was in college, it was a gender studies class, and the professor asked us to go up to the board and write down all the derogatory terms for females that we could think of, and you can imagine. Uh, it filled up a board, and some of them are very shocking and sexualized, as you know. And then the professor said, "Now I want you to erase all of those and write the ones for males that you can think of." And everyone could think of like one or two, you know. So there you go. Uh, that's what I'm referring to about language and culture. You know, you need to. It isn't just changing the rules; it's a much bigger change than that. So, of course, uh, efforts to change contact sports to minimize violence have elicited very strong responses from men who don't want to see collision sports, quote, go soft. Okay. Rule changes can be helpful, but there's no way to reduce the violence without making structural changes in how the sports are played. So we're going to look at another disturbing area, which is sexual violence in sports. Sexual violence by male athletes, you know, there are many highly publicized cases of assault, sexual assault, rape, and gang rape. Those reports, media coverage, create the impression that on the field violence influences off the field actions and relationships, especially with women. Because athletes are public figures and often celebrities, we hear about violence often in the media that they perpetrate, male athletes, which leads to the impression that male athletes are more violent and misogynistic than other men. So, whether there is or not, and there needs to be a lot more research done on that, there is a need for sport teams and management to directly address this issue, but there's also a need to understand the factors that influence violent off the field actions. And the research consistently indicates that male college athletes are more often involved than other students where there are reported charges for sexual misconduct, for sexual assault, and sexual and domestic violence. The statistics for male athletes are similar to those for men in fraternities. And I don't think there's any surprise there. The hypothesis from research by the authors of this research is that violence against women by male athletes is associated with a sport culture characterized by certain beliefs. So, the first belief is that violence is an effective strategy for establishing manhood, achieving status as an athlete, and controlling women. Another is that athletes should not be held to the same normative standards that apply to others. Then a third is that people outside the fraternities or elite athletes do not deserve the respect or concern that athletes reserve for each other. And this one, of course, that most women are sexually attracted to athletes and can be sexually exploited without consequences. Okay, that's the athletes. Now, what about sexual assaults by coaches, trainers, and doctors? In research by the Seattle Times, 159 coaches in Washington state, where only 2% of the population lives of the United States, were fired or reprimanded for sexual offenses between 1993 and 2003. 159 coaches. This pattern has been repeated many times, unfortunately, after the years of the study. The biggest sports story of 2016 through 2018 was that hundreds of girls and young women were sexually assaulted over nearly 20 years by sport medicine doctor Larry Nassar. Excuse me just a minute. I'll put a video up for you of it's a very powerful video of aspects of the trial and the young women gymnasts talking about their experiences. So, I'm sure you're familiar with that. It's been such a big story with Larry Nassar, and I think the video it's much more powerful than me going through all the details for you. What about violence among spectators? Do sports incite violence among spectators? Well, we don't know, but there's research. We do know some of it. There hasn't been as much research on that. But the research that did go through this, let me see, just a sec. I'm on. Oh yes, this is about domestic violence. And you've probably heard, or maybe you haven't. Super Bowl Sunday is not a good day for wives and girlfriends generally. Often there's, and here's the research. Okay, they analyzed the woman who did the research analyzed arrest records through 2008, 2009 NFL seasons, and also hospital admissions. Let me see if I've overlooked the. No, I didn't. Okay. There was a significantly greater number of domestic violence arrests during the hours for which NFL games were televised than during the same hours on comparable non-sports Sundays. So let's do that again. Significantly greater amount of violence, domestic violence arrests during the hours for which NFL games were televised than during the same hours on comparable non-sports Sundays. Overall, the research concluded that, quote, the average football game day is more dangerous to women as victims of domestic violence than any other game of the week. And Super Bowl Sunday, there's been a lot of research on that. That's even higher than just the regular NFL game days. Okay. So sociologists have really helped in identifying those factors and to develop social strategies that take them into account. We know that when spectators perceive violence on the field, they're more likely to engage in violence in the venue. And perceived hostility and violence can often be diffused by players and coaches. This is so interesting, I think. Such a simple thing to do. Perceived hostility and violence can often be diffused if players and coaches make public announcements emphasizing respect for the game and for opponents. One of the most important preventative measures of spectator violence is to know the needs and rights of the spectators. What about terrorism and political violence at sports events? And the definition of terrorism is a special form of violence designed to intimidate and target a population of people for the purpose of achieving political or social goals. And terrorism almost always targets civilian environments, such as the Boston Marathon. So today, there are security strategies that are part of every routine at major sports venues, but the very fear of terrorism, of course, as you know, has many consequences. And now, in addition to terrorism, we have mass shootings. That's an epidemic in the United States. Although, knock on wood, we have not seen any major ones at sports events at this point. Okay, we're going to go on to chapter 7.